let's review book of the month. Hi, I'm Kelly Delaney, and since my book of the month themed videos tend to get wider viewership than my other ones, I'm going to give you a little bit of introduction on why you should follow me on YouTube. I talk about books and writing. I read pretty much every genre you can think of with the exception of horror, and I sometimes talk about being an indie and soon to be traditionally published author on this channel. So if you like the sound of that, hang out. I also do one-ish video a month on book of the month if that's why you're here. I did something a little crazy. So I always do a video in which I review all the books I got in the past year from book of the month because I do really like having that subscription service. And this year, instead of just tier ranking them, which is what I usually do, I literally ranked them from my least favorite to most favorite, which was kind of fun, if I'm being honest. Usually I don't like doing that, but I had a pretty good time doing that. I still have them in tiers, and the tiers are not for me. Books that I just didn't like. I never think that like a book is bad. It's just you're not the right audience for it. I have a not for me. I have okay, which means that like I didn't really enjoy the book, but like I understand it had like some parts that I thought was like, oh, okay, that was okay. And then solid read, which is like, that was a good book. It didn't really stand out to me very much, but it was a good book. I didn't really have to like force myself to read every single word. There might be some parts where I thought it was like a little too slow. Next is great, books I just walked away from really enjoying. And last is I used to call this my putting it in my veins tier, but I think I'm going to switch it to amazing because put it in my veins sounds insane. My amazing tier. Those are like books that I can't stop thinking about, books that I can't stop talking about, books that I recommend to a lot of people. Not like just like someone said, hey, do you know a book like this? Like just a general recommendation. So there's 27. So let's get started. I DNF'd one book this year from book of the month, and I tend to keep it around one, maybe two. I think I did two last year. I just couldn't get into this book. It has fantastic ratings on Goodreads. On paper, it seemed like I should love it, but it just was not a book I could get into, and I'm not going to force myself to read it because it's quite long. And it's Clytemnestra by Costanza Casati. It was an add-on, I think, in May, so it wasn't one of the book of the month picks, but I couldn't get into this book. I read the first, I think, 120 pages, didn't like it, and it's 432 pages. I wasn't going to force myself to finish it. If it had been like 250 pages, I probably would have muscled through it, but I decided not to. So that's my one DNF. I'm going to sell it. Next, I had one book that's not for me. And I know a lot of people really like this book, but I just did not like it, but I did finish it, but it was not a book for me. And that was The Last Word by Taylor Adams. This book is written in two parts, in two voices, I should say. One of the voices is the heroine of the story who writes a bad review for a horror novel and then begins getting stalked by the author. And the other voice is the author, writing, like what the author is writing. And I think about 150 pages in, I decided to just not read the author's part because I really dislike that voice so much, which might also be the fact that I don't ever read horror. So that might be why I felt that way. But I just got to a point where like I couldn't read anymore and I wanted to finish the book. So I just read the other character's voice. It just wasn't for me. I know a lot of people really liked it. We're going to try this for a little while. It's a sunny January day. All right, so next I have The Vaster Wilds by Lauren Groff. This I would put in okay. So we've moved out of the not for me and we're in the okay section. This is like a brilliantly written novel, but so depressing, gross, and like, I think grotesque is probably a better word than gross, to the point that I did not enjoy reading this at all. It's historical lit fic, and it's definitely lit fic versus historical fic in terms of like the feel of the writing and of the story. But you basically follow this character who escapes the siege of Jamestown, I think it is, and she's a servant. And then you're just watching all the horrible things that happen to her while she tries to survive in the wilderness. And I did not enjoy this book at all. I was so happy to finish it. It was short. It's just I like lit fic and I like historical fic, and I don't mind books that are like about trials and tribulations and horrible things happening, as you will see in some of these books. But this one just didn't work for me. Okay, so this next one that I had for okay, I feel I'm going to give you like such an explanation in every single one of these. I think that if this book was like a novelette, I would have loved it. And I think that is a problem that we have in publishing, that like you have to write a book of a certain length for it to be recognized traditionally. Because I do think this story was really good and I really liked the writing, but it was way too long, like 150 pages too long. I think that this would have worked awesome as like a 50-page story that you study in high school or college. And that's The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshani Chokshi. Or Chokshi, sorry, I said her last name wrong. I think her writing is really cool. It's very flowery and it works because this is like kind of like a modern day fairy tale. I don't remember what they have it in fantasy. But I think that it was a little too long, if that makes sense. It just dragged on too much. So it's almost 300 pages. It's 290 pages. But I do think if you told this same story in like a tight 50 to 100 pages, I would have loved it. Next in my okay slot is The Unfortunate Side Effects of Heartbreak and Magic by Brianne Randall. I really wanted to love this book. It was like all over Instagram and TikTok and probably BookTube. About it being like Gilmore Girls meet Practical Magic. I don't think that was a fair assessment of how to explain the plot. I think it's more like Practical Magic meets Sweet Magnolias. It has extremely descriptive writing to the point that I was getting bored with the descriptive writing. I also think the second half of the book suffered a little bit from like too many new characters, and it was hard to follow some of the rules of the magic system in this book, and I really didn't like the tropes used in the love story, which is a big thing for me as a romance reader. So yeah, that's why this one just didn't really work for me. So my next two books I had on the border of okay and solid read. I wasn't really sure which section to put them in. So the first one is What the River Knows by Isabel Ibanez. This, I think the reason I didn't rank it higher is because it's a YA book. I don't really read YA, but you'll see this is my lowest ranked YA, and I do have 3 on the list this year, which is like the most YA I've read since I was a YA librarian and kind of overdosed on young adult. This is kind of like a mummy retelling, but it's about a girl who lives in Buenos Aires in the late 1800s, and her parents die in Egypt, and she goes to kind of investigate and very quickly meets a man who's basically Rick from The Mummy. And yeah, I wanted a little bit more action, and I do think that I just don't like the beats of a YA novel, which this had. So like I would still recommend this to an actual young adult looking for an adventure romance. Next that I was like on the border of okay and solid read was She Started It by, I don't know if that's Cian or Sean Gilbert. This is a thriller about a woman. It's like a group of women who were terrible bullies to this other girl in like middle school and high school. And then she invites them to go on this like all expenses paid, glamorous bachelorette party in the Caribbean. And then people start dying. And my issue with this was I found it hard to suspend belief that 1, these women would go on this trip, and 2, I guess the twist almost immediately on like before page 50, I think. So that made it a little like not as exciting to read, because to me, the twist was quite obvious. Maybe it wasn't to everybody, but that was pretty much the reason I didn't like this book very much. Okay, so now we're moving into the solid reads. Like these are solid reads. So from now on, these are books that I enjoyed reading. And the first is What Lies in the Woods by Kate Alice Marshall. This is about 3 women, and we bounced between when they were 11 and they used to play this game in the woods called the Goddess Game. And one of them is brutally attacked, and then they all tell a lie, and someone goes to jail. And then we go to the present, and one of them is tired of lying. And I really liked I thought Kate Alice Marshall did a really good job capturing what it felt like to be 11, so I thought she did such a good job at that. And I really liked that part of the book. This came out in January of 2023, so it was one of the first books I read of the year, and I liked it. Next, I have one of the last books I read this year, and it's Ink, Blood, Sister, Scribe. This was a June pick, but I didn't get it, I think, till October, and I didn't read it until January. I started it in December, but I didn't finish it before the year ended. And this is a contemporary fantasy that uses books and blood, Ink, Blood, Sister, Scribe, as their sort of like magic system. And the reason I don't have this ranked higher is I did think the last 100 pages of this were very exciting, but I had a kind of a difficult time getting into it and thought that there's 3 different narrators at the beginning and thought that some of the narrators were stronger than the others, which was part of the reason I had a hard time with it. I liked it. I thought it was a solid, good fantasy read. I think if you read a lot of contemporary fantasy, you'd probably like this one. And then my last one in the solid read section is The London Sand Society by Sarah Penner. This is historical fantasy / magical realism. I feel like Sarah Penner does a good job at sort of blending that line of magical realism and fantasy. We have Lena, whose sister has been murdered, and she seeks out Vaudeline, who is a spiritualist, like she runs seances, to try and figure out what happened. And you travel between Paris and London, and it's the 1870s, I think, 1873, and it had a very good historical setting. I liked the excitement of the plot. There's some queer love in here if you want to read some historical queer love, which I thought was very well done. And yeah, it was like a solid, good read. I didn't think it was as good as The Lost Apothecary, but I still really liked it. I'll still buy more of Sarah Penner's books when they come out. Now we're in my great section, and we have another book by Kate Ellis Marshall. It's kind of funny that these were so close together. They only had 2 together, 2 books in between them. And this one, No One Can Know, is about 3 sisters whose parents were murdered when they were like 12 to, I think the oldest is 17, and there's 3 of them. One of the sisters, Emma, has just sort of like her life's just sort of fallen apart. She's married, she's unexpectedly pregnant, her husband loses his job, they lose their place to live, she's a freelance worker, and he's like, well, let's just go live in your childhood home that you have access to. And she decides to, but he doesn't know anything other than her parents died when she was a teen, and he does not know that she was the main suspect. And everyone in the town still thinks she murdered her parents. So that was a big secret she probably should have told her husband. She's our main narrator, but we do get some narration from the other 2 siblings. This is another one of those books where you bounce between the past and the present, and I thought that Kate Ellis Marshall did a really good job keeping you on your toes with both, and I liked the way it ended. It ended, wow, and kind of crazy, but I liked it. We're less than halfway done. Let's keep going. Next, I've got The Unmaking of June by Adrienne Young. This was my book of the month pick in October, and this was a beautiful story. Okay, so I'm going to start by saying this is sort of like it's not a slow-paced book, but it's definitely medium-paced. So if you're looking for a fantasy that you're just going to like fly through, this is probably not the fantasy for you. It has a ton of character development in it, and there's like a big twist that I don't want to give away that happens in the middle of the book. So you're in North Carolina, and there's this family of women, and they all sort of lose their minds. And either they lose their minds and they die, having lost their minds, or they disappear. June is our main character. Her mom disappeared. Her grandma's losing her mind, and she thinks she's starting to lose her mind because she's starting to hallucinate. She has seen a door, and she can hear things that she knows aren't there. And then the story goes from there when a family friend tells her she needs to go through the door. I loved it. I think Adrienne Young, she builds, because I read her other book, Spells for Forgetting. She builds such a quiet fantasy, which I really like. This is not like a crazy adventure, like explosions. It's a quiet fantasy, which doesn't make it any less exciting, but it just, the tone is so even and lovely, and it has a great sense of place. I really loved it, and I loved the ending. This could have gone 2 very distinct ways, and I love the way she took it. With another fantasy that's not a quiet fantasy, I have Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. I read this, I think, last January, a long time ago, and it's got great winter vibes if you're looking for a wintry book, as you can tell by the cover. But we follow 3 women, young women, probably like older teens, who are living in sort of a fantasy version of what I picture to be like Eastern Europe / Russia. And what I liked about this is that it's a fantasy version of that area, and there's a Jewish community. So she did put some like realistic stuff into this fantasy world. This book came out in 2018 also. I got this as a backlist. So Miriam is our main character, but we have several narrators, and she is the daughter of a moneylender, and there becomes this like legend about her that she can turn silver into gold. And so a legit elf prince who is not nice kidnaps her and is like, turn silver into gold. And she's like, I turn silver into gold by like buying things and turning that, like, she just is like good with money. And so she gets in that kind of predicament, very Rumpelstiltskin-like. But then you also have Wanda, who's a peasant girl who her family has taken in to kind of like save from death. And then you also have a daughter of a lord who is supposed to marry the Tsar, who's like legit a demon. And I thought it was very fun. The thing I liked most about this book when I was reading it is I kept thinking, if I had read this book in like 2006, 2007, this would have been my favorite book. And that's fun to, like, as you get older, reflect about how your reading tastes change, and also just like think back about how, like, oh my gosh, 22, 23-year-old me would have absolutely adored this book. 24, I can't remember how old I was at that age. I was in my 20s in those years. Next, we have my second young adult book of the entire year, and it's A Wilderness of Stars by Shea Ernshaw. Shea Ernshaw is such a master of writing a book in which you cannot place where or when you are. So I read her book, A History of Wild Places, which I loved and made my husband read, and he did enjoy it too. And that book, you're not sure when you are. You know a kind of where you are. This book, you don't know where or when you are. All you know is that there's this girl and she needs to go on a quest-ish, like she needs to travel because she's an astronomer, and something has happened in the stars, and it's been passed down her whole life that when that happens, she needs to get to another place in this place she lives. And it has some, like, I don't even know how to tell you the vibes without giving it away. It does have that like Chosen One vibes, and it has a love story. And I think that if you like those kinds of young adult stories, you'd really like this one. I tend to feel somewhat indifferent about that, but did really enjoy Wilderness of Stars. And I'll definitely read more Shea Ernshaw. She's written 2 books now that I really enjoyed. Another book that I thought was great was Dark Corners by Megan Golden. I feel like there's going to be a rush of thrillers written where the like amateur detective now is a podcaster, because I have 2 in my pile this year. This is one of them. So Rachel Kroll is a podcaster. She's like a true crime podcaster. Terrence Bailey, who is someone she has been investigating, is about to get released from prison. And a couple days before he's released, he is visited by an influencer named Madison. And then she disappears. And the really cool thing about this is that Madison doesn't seem to exist anywhere except online. So the FBI asked this podcaster to help because they feel like the guy who's in jail might talk to her because she does all these true crime podcasts, and maybe he'll think that she'll like help him clear his name. And really they think that he did something, that she knew something and he did something. And I thought this was really good. And here's a cool thing about it. Megan Golden did a really good job accounting for technology, because sometimes you read, I mean, I'm going to be honest, writing stories, creating stories has become much more difficult since we are all basically connected to our phones at all time. And she did a very good job making the exciting parts of this work, even with technology being part of it. If you like thrillers, and if you're at all interested in like what it means to be an influencer and what influencers' lives actually look like, I would really recommend this, because a big part of this book is about this like influencer con that's going on that Rachel goes undercover to like attend to try to find out anything about Madison, and like seeing how influencers live was pretty cool. The next book I thought was great was Edvika and the Hollywood Wives by Kirthana Ramisetti. And this book was a little similar to Evelyn Hugo, but I'll explain why it's different. So Edvika is a sort of like failed screenwriter. She's in her late 20s and her life's kind of a mess. There is a content warning that her twin sister has died recently, and she just has not been able to get over her grief. She had like won awards for a screenwriting when she was a student, but nothing happened. She's working an event. It's like an after Oscars party, but like they don't call it that. And she meets this guy, Julian, and he's like very famous Hollywood royalty director and a lot older than her. He's in his either late 60s or early 70s. I can't remember. And he kind of just charms her, and they start dating, and then they get married like very fast. It's like a total whirlwind, and you kind of follow it through her point of view, where you're not like, you feel like she doesn't love this guy, but she like likes him enough, and her life is such a mess that she's like, why not? Why not just marry this guy? And he's like very much into the idea of her becoming a screenwriter. So one of his ex-wives dies, and she basically says to whoever is currently married to Julian, I will give you $1 million and a single copy of a VHS tape, if you divorce him. And now she has to think about it. And she's never dived into his life before, and now she really does, because he has some pretty interesting ex-wives. And I thought it was really fun. You get that whole like old Hollywood feel. It has a little bit of some thriller vibes in the second half, but not like hardcore, but like a few points I'm like, is she gonna be okay? But I liked it. The only thing I didn't like was the ending. So I'm just saying that. Other people probably loved it. I did not like the last, 10 pages or whatever. Just me personally. If you want to talk about it, not in a spoilery setting, I would love to. Speaking of Evelyn Hugo, my next book was Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid, which I did very much enjoy, but I didn't love as much as Evelyn Hugo and Daisy Jones and the Six. I put Evelyn Hugo definitely in the amazing, and I would ranked Daisy Jones and the Six a little bit higher. But I really liked this book. I thought it was great. We are following the Riva kids, who are Mick Riva's children. And Mick Riva is in Evelyn Hugo. He's like her shortest marriage. And I think the best way to describe how he's characterized is he's kind of like an Elvis personality. Like, he is this huge rock star that sort of transcends generations. He's not short-lived, though. And he has 4 kids who he kind of abandoned. And this story takes place all in 24 hours, where they're throwing this big party in Malibu, but also jumps back into like the 50s, 60s, and 70s about them growing up. And I loved it. It was a really good, I think Taylor Jenkins Reid does a really good job at building these stories and worlds in which you fall into them and you can't get out. Like, you can't stop reading this book when you're reading it. You just want to not work, not do anything, just sit and read. And I felt very much like that reading Malibu Rising, which I feel like is one of the best reviews you can give a book. We're still in the great. I have 3 more books in the great, and then we'll get into the amazing. And right now, I'm going to tell you about None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell. This was a very unsettling thriller. So this is about Alex and Josie, who just meet by chance at a restaurant one night because it's both of their birthdays. Josie's out with her husband, who's much older than her, and she's like annoyed at him. And Alex is kind of fabulous, and they're the same age too. I think they both just turned 40. Alex has this very handsome husband. She has all these friends, and Alex is a kind of famous podcaster, and Josie recognizes her. They go in the bathroom at the same time, and Josie says something like, oh, we're birthday twins. It's my birthday too. And then they figure out that they were born on the same day. They're the same age. And Josie says kind of like, I think you should interview me on your podcast. Now, Alex has mainly done like stories of phenomenal women on her podcast, and she's feeling a little bit stunted. And so she decides to invite Josie on her podcast. And that turns out to be a very bad decision, because what goes forward is crazy. I think None of This Is True is such a good title, because throughout this entire book, you do not know who is telling the truth basically ever. And I like that. I like those kind of like unreliable, you have no idea who's a reliable character. It was very fun, but also very unsettling. Keep that in mind. Let's talk about Wayward by Amelia Hart. I bought this book solely based on the cover and ended up really enjoying it. So that was good. This is a weird book to classify. So it was a magical realism, I think is what Book of the Month called it, but Goodreads had it in the historical fiction. I would kind of put magical realism better, because historical fiction doesn't really encompass all of it. We have 3 narrators, and one of them's in 2019. So you are grounded in contemporary world, but one of them's in the 1940s and one of them's in like 1609, I think, 1619. And they're 3 women of the same bloodline, and they all have like really bad stuff happening to them. Kate is pregnant by an extremely abusive husband, and she's on the run. Violet is a teen in World War II, and she's living in like a crumbling estate, and her father hates her, and no one will tell her about her dead mother. And then Alpha is awaiting a witch trial. And so there's a lot going on. Okay. All these women have this cool thing where they can sort of talk to birds and bugs, which I loved. There's a lot of content warnings in this, so I am just going to tell you them plain out, which some of them are slightly spoilery, but just so you know, because you do need to know going into this. There is on-page domestic abuse, domestic violence in this. There is on-page rape, like full-on rape. There is on-page unsafe abortion, I think is the best way to put it, like historical abortion that's extremely unsafe. I actually can't remember if it's on page or not, but you definitely get the feeling that Alpha has had some torture from her witch trial, but I can't remember if that's on page or if she's just reflecting on it. So no matter what, there's a lot of extremely disturbing content in here. I don't think that takes away from the book, but I know a lot of people don't want to read stuff like that. So just so you know, that is in here. But if you were looking for a great, very well paced, even like every narrator is just as good as the other, you're not going to like anyone's story more than the other, which I thought was very important story, get Wayward. My last book in the great section, and the best thriller I read this year, is The Writing Retreat by Julia Bartz. This is about a writing retreat in which a lot of stuff goes wrong. So our main character is Alex, and she is kind of having like a little bit of like a late 20s crisis. She's a writer. She feels like nothing's going right in her life. She's just had a horrible friendship breakup with her best friend, Ren. And they were both obsessed with this writer named Rosa, and her last name is escaping me right now. But that writer does this retreat for young writers every once in a while. I don't think it's every year. I think it's every few years, where she invites a bunch of young female writers to her estate in, I think you're in upstate New York. She has you write like mad for a month and then you're done. Alex gets chosen very last minute to do this, and she goes. And when she gets there, Ren is there too. They've both been chosen. And Rosa seems, excuse my language, batshit crazy out of the gate, and making them do all these really weird things, and they're not sleeping and they're doing weird drugs, and you can't trust your mind anymore. And you aren't sure if Alex is going insane or if like the house is just haunted or if there's a murderer there. It's one of those stories where you just feel like you don't know who to trust. You don't know what's happening. The sense of dread built in this was so phenomenal that my husband went out of town when I was reading it, and I had to stop reading it until he got back because I was too scared. But my best thriller of the year. Very enjoyable. If you didn't pick it up, definitely do. Now we're getting into the amazing section. Let's move some books over so I can reach them. This is gonna be a big mess. I have 7 books in my amazing section. So let's do, these are my top 7 books I read from Book of the Month this year. Number 7 is The 5-Star Weekend by Ellen Hilderbrand. Here's the thing about Ellen Hilderbrand. She can write a sense of place so well. You feel like you're on Nantucket. You want to move to Nantucket. I feel like she builds the world of Nantucket as well as someone builds a fantasy world, which I just think is amazing. This is about a woman who is recently surprise widowed. So it starts with the death of her husband, and she is like semi-famous. During the pandemic, she started this cooking channel, and now it's kind of exploded. And she decides that she's going to have this thing called the 5-Star Weekend, which she finds some blog about it, and invite her 4 best friends from different stages of life. So they're not necessarily friends with each other. So she invites her best friend from high school, her best friend from college, her best friend from when she was a young mom, and she's supposed to invite like a new best friend, and she doesn't really have one. So she invites this woman who she's kind of bonded with, who comments on her videos. And they all come to Nantucket, and she has this lavish weekend planned for them. And it doesn't go great, mainly because her best friend from high school and her best friend from college know each other already, and they hate each other. And it's just this explosion of beautiful scene description and food description, and women who are older and like talking about heartbreak and stuff like that. And I really liked it. It's a great book to read when you want to just like escape into summer, if that makes sense. It's very loosely connected to the Hotel Nantucket, which I read last year, in that they talk about a few of the characters just in the first chapter, but you don't have to read that book first, but they're both very enjoyable. Number 6 is Banyan Moon by Tao Tai. This is, I would call it a generational story. Goodreads called it historical fiction, and I think Book of the Month called it contemporary fiction. It's about 3 women in the same family. And so Anne is the daughter, and she's been living in Michigan, and she gets pregnant accidentally. And she decides to come home to Florida, where her mom and grandma live, and sort of figure out what she's going to do with her life. And she's not young. She's like in her late 20s, I think, or maybe even 30. So it's not like, oh my God, my life is over. It's just like, what is she going to do with her life? Her mom is, I think it's pronounced Hyung, but I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly because it's a Vietnamese name. She lives in Florida, but we get her story of like in the 90s. when Anne is a baby and about her husband and hers relationship and what it was like with him. I don't want to give you too many spoilers, but that's like a big part of her story. And then lastly, you have Min, who's the grandma, and she escaped Vietnam during the Vietnam War with 2 small children. And you jump between all 3 of their stories, and it's just beautiful. It's just like a great generational, well-written story. And I loved how it ended because it did not end perfectly. And I thought that was very appropriate to make it seem realistic. I'll definitely read another book by Tao Tai because I thought she did a phenomenal job writing, and I really enjoyed this book a lot. If you like generational stories, definitely get this one. Also, it's called Banyan Moon because the house they live in Florida, they call Banyan House because there's a giant banyan tree in the backyard. There you go. Number 5 for me was Mame by Jessica George. This is a contemporary fiction. Like, that's definitely where it belongs. And it's about a 25-year-old named Maddie, and she's having kind of a quarter-life crisis. And she's been taking care of her father, who has Parkinson's, basically alone. Her parents are Ghanaian immigrants living in London, and her mom basically lives in Ghana. She doesn't really come back to London anymore and help take care of her dad, and her brother doesn't really help her either. So there's a lot of stress on Maddie to take care of her dad. At the beginning of the book, her mom comes back and tells her to move out and tells her to be a 25-year-old and have fun and make friends and try to find a boyfriend and all that. And Maddie does. I'm going to give you a big spoiler because I kind of wish I knew this going in. In the middle of the book, her dad does die. So a lot of this book is about grief and guilt that she feels very much like if she hadn't moved out, he wouldn't have died. Spoiler over. I thought Jessica George did a phenomenal job capturing what it feels like to be in your 20s and have no idea what you want to do with your life. She did a great job at it. Number 4, I Have Some Questions for You by Rebecca Makkai. It's my first Rebecca Makkai book and I loved it. So we have Bodhi as our main character. She is a podcaster and she's been asked to come teach classes at her boarding school alma mater. So it's high school. And she does. And one of the classes is podcasting, and she assigns the students that they each need to come up with the idea for a podcast that has to do with the school because she doesn't want it to be like too broad of topics. And one of her students asks if she can do the murder of Thalia Keith. And Bodhi says yes, but Bodhi was a student there when Thalia was murdered, and they had been roommates. They were not roommates when Thalia died, but they had been roommates the year before. And Bodhi had never really felt at ease with the person who was in jail for her murder. His name's Omar Evans. I believe he's a black man, but now for some reason my brain is like, was he Middle Eastern? But I'm almost positive he was a black man. And he was the custodian and was very quickly arrested, tried, sentenced to prison for a very long time. So now we follow Bodhi and her class trying to figure out basically if the right person's in jail. This is not a thriller. This is a lit fic, and I think you need to go into it knowing that. So it doesn't have thriller pacing. It's very long. It's too long to be a thriller. It has lit fic pacing with thriller vibes, if that makes sense, since it is about a murder and you do have a lot of like investigation stuff going on. You also have some very like lit fic writing and lit fic pacing. I loved it. I probably should read more of her books because this was great. Number 3 is a book I finished yesterday, which is kind of crazy. And I don't know why it took me so long to read this book. Okay. Preface, I did say that I don't really read YA anymore because I read too much YA. I was a YA librarian for a very long time. Before that, I worked in a bookstore and I was in charge of the young adult fantasy section. So pre-YA having this sort of resurgence, which it's been popular a lot. Like when I was working, The Hunger Games came out. So it's not like, and Twilight, oh my God. But so I feel like there's been another like burst of YA recently. And so I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent. Like I read A Court of Thorns and Roses, the first book, and then I didn't read the rest of the series because I'm sure it gets phenomenal, but I just didn't really want to devote the time it would take to read that enormous series. So this is a book that I was kind of like hemming and hawing. And then I saw a bunch of like Instagram aesthetics on it. And I was like, that looks like a book I would like. So I'll get it from Book of the Month. And then I bought it in December and I just hadn't read it. I was like, I'll read it in January. Freaking loved this book. It was Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. Oh my God. This is not, the aesthetics I was looking at is not how I picture this book at all. So I saw stuff that was so like, this is dark academia. And I was like, oh, okay. I don't feel like this is dark academia at all. This is how I would pitch this book to you. This is about war correspondence during a fantasy war, but you feel like you're in World War One, which I'm gonna be honest, I always talk about how I don't really like World War II stories. I do like World War One stories. I thought Fall of Giants by Ken Follett was phenomenal because I think World War One just isn't studied as much, and it's a more interesting war because there wasn't really like a morality. It was basically a bunch of like cousins who were royals who were mad at each other. I digress. This book, oh my God. Also, there's like love letters in it and there's like a magic typewriter, and I'm not going to do a good job explaining it, but you should read this book. Iris is our main character. Roman is our secondary narrator. Iris is poor and she has a job at a newspaper, and her brother has heard this call from this goddess that he needs to go fight for her. So he's gone. She lives with her mother, who is a very bad alcoholic. Roman is from a very wealthy family, but he feels like he has no choices whatsoever in what he's supposed to do with his life. He works at the Gazette with Iris. Lots of stuff happens and they both end up being war correspondents, and the book is beautiful from then on. I had so much to do yesterday and I had like 100 pages left. And then finally I was like, I should just sit down and read it because it's making me very distracted. And so I did. I sat down and read it. And then I was like, okay, well, I just sat down and read those 100 pages. And it ends on a crazy cliffhanger, and I already put the second book in my book of the month box for February, so I can read it in February. And I immediately was like, well, I have to go to the grocery store because I had writing work to do, and I'm like, I'm not going to be able to concentrate. Because also whenever I finish a really good book, all I can think about is what an inadequate writer I am. So basically that's what I was feeling like. And so I went to the grocery store, and then the entire time in the grocery store, I'm like, I can't stop thinking about this book. I feel a little better today, but I still think it's phenomenal. You should read this book. I shouldn't have judged it on being YA. I shouldn't have. You're going to probably get a review for Ruthless Vows in February or March. My second favorite book is a book I read in December. I really killed it at the end of the year. And that is The Frozen River by Ariel Lawhon. This is a historical fiction. It was an add-on, and it was phenomenal. So it's based on the true journals of the midwife Martha Ballard, who was a midwife in early America and never lost a mother. So she never lost a patient. Obviously, she didn't always deliver living children, but she never lost a patient. And she kept a meticulous journal, which you can read. And so the author weaved in her journal entries and wrote this phenomenal story that is fictional about her, but like kind of like what her life would have looked like. So many content warnings in this book. So you jump around in time, but the present, which is 1789 in Maine, there is a woman in her town who accused two men of raping her and is now pregnant. And Martha is the midwife of town. One of those men ends up dead in the river, and Martha's asked to examine the body, and she concludes that he was murdered. And then a judge in the town asks another doctor to examine the body, who concludes he wasn't murdered. The judge is the other person who was accused of raping this woman. And then you follow a trial. You jump back in time a lot with Martha's life and her children who are now grown. She's in her early 50s and she has 6 living children and 3 who are deceased. And she is so in love with her husband still, and he is so in love with her. For content warnings, obviously, sexual assault, on-page sexual assault at points. Also, there is like a lot of PTSD description of sexual assault in here. There's murder. There's so much childbirth in here, which is hard to read. I mean, it's not hard for me to read, but hard to read for some people. But I absolutely loved this book. And if you like historical fiction, if you like historical mystery, if you want to read a fantastic love story that's like secondary but amazing still, then this is the book for you. And lastly, my best book of the year with book of the month was The Invisible Hour by Alice Hoffman. I do love Alice Hoffman, so if there's going to be an Alice Hoffman book, you know it's going to be hard to beat. This is about, Alice Hoffman's books are always like a little bit hard to describe. So we start with Ivy, and Ivy gets pregnant when she's a teenager, and she leaves her family, and she kind of gets taken in by this cult. And then we jump ahead to her daughter Mia escaping the cult when she's a teenager. And Alice Hoffman makes you care about these characters so much. You care so much about Ivy, who's only your narrator for like 30 pages. And then you care so much about Mia trying to get out of that cult. And she does. I don't think that's spoilery. But there is this weird part, because I'm talking only about the first half of the book, in which Mia finds a copy of the Scarlet Letter in the library. And it says to Mia in it. And it sort of inspires her to change her life. And then the second half of the book, Mia meets Nathaniel Hawthorne, and he's a main character. So it's definitely fantasy because Nathaniel Hawthorne's in it. And this book made me want to reread The Scarlet Letter, which I hated, which I think is magic that it was able to do that. Otherwise, great character development, wonderful poetic writing, a beautiful story, and a book that made me want to reread one of my most hated high school reads. So that cements it as number one. Oh my gosh, are you still here? If you are still here, thank you so much. This was a long video, but I really love Book of the Month. I'll put a link in the description with my code so you can get one. You can get your first book for like $5. As you can see, lots of different genres. I just realized I usually like write down beforehand what how many I have in each genre, and I didn't do it. Sorry about that. I don't really think there was any standout. So I had YA, I have thrillers, I had historical fiction, I had contemporary fiction, I had some fantasy in here, a lot of magical realism, I feel like. But yeah, pretty well-rounded. If you're still here, please in the comments tell me if you read any of these books and which ones you loved, hated, whatever. Let me know everything. I love hearing other people's opinions of books. If you're still here and you want to let me know you made it to the end of the video without writing words, give me 4 big stack of books emojis, because the big stack of books all over my living room floor is going to take me about 45 minutes to clean up, I feel like. And as always, I hope you're in the middle of a good book, about to start reading a good book, or about to start writing a great book. I'll see you soon.